So,
Cool.
this week my guest is Graham Allcott. Graham is the author of the global bestseller, How to Be a Productivity Ninja. He is the founder of Think Productive, one of the world's leading providers of personal productivity training and consultancy. His podcast, Beyond Busy, explores the issues of productivity, work-life balance, and how people define happiness in their lives. Previous roles include Chief Executive of Student Volunteering England, Head of Volunteering at the University of Birmingham, and Advisor to the UK Government on Youth and Volunteering Policy. I'll say that last bit again. Advisor to the UK Government on Youth Volunteering Policy. So, Graham, thank you very much for joining me.
Great to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. I've not interviewed a ninja before.
although you once told me that you'd become a ninja from reading the book.
Well, we're going to explore some of that, actually. I need you to help me sharpen some of my skills. So,
Sure.
But when you were a youngster, did you wake up one morning and say, I'm going to be a ninja? Or did you have other plans for your life?
No. So my original first career, as you were just kind of in the lead off alluding to there, was in volunteering and the charity world. And the big transition for me came when I left the job of Chief Executive of Student Volunteering England. So I became a Chief Executive at quite a young age. And then I left that job. I went freelance. I was doing freelance strategy and fundraising and stuff like that in the charity sector. And one day I had a really great idea, and I looked up from my desk, as I would always do, to see who was going to help me with it, and realized that because I was freelance, I was on my own and didn't have a team and didn't have all these people that could help me achieve stuff. And I realized in that moment that the first part of my career was basically me having ideas, getting lots of other people to do most of the work, and then calling it leadership and getting away with it for quite a long time, and realized that actually my own skills around being a completer finisher, around being, focused on particular tasks were just not that great. So I set about changing me. That was really the start of the ninja journey. And my natural style is quite flaky, strategic, big picture. So if I can develop the skills to make myself a completer finisher and someone who can be down in the detail and really get clarity around everything I'm doing, then I kind of felt like, well, if I can do that for me, I can do that for anybody else. And that was really where the kind of idea for Think Productive, my business, really came from. But
volunteering is also a challenging role, and it's not something people think about doing. How did you get into volunteering? What brought you that? Was that a family thing?
Well, yes and no. It's funny, I did a podcast interview a few weeks ago, and it was all about childhood, and it was quite interesting to sort of make some of the linkages with, I sort of grew up in a background where my parents were heavily involved in different churches and stuff like that. And I think you always have that kind of influence, don't you, from your family, in terms of, I always felt like I was lucky that my family gave me really good morals and very sort of high ethical values. But no, volunteering really was something, I got to university, and I'd been working for a year before that for HSBC, doing a year out and being a supervisor in one of their data centers, basically. And then having gone from full-time work to being a student, I just felt really guilty that I had 12 hours a week. And I was just like, what am I doing with my time? And so I ended up, alongside my studies, doing a lot of volunteering, and ended up running some kids camps for 8 to 11-year-old kids around Birmingham, taking them out to Wales and beaches and places they'd never been. And it was really through doing lots of volunteering as a student that I decided that was something I wanted to promote in my work. So then I fell into jobs that were around charities and volunteering.
Fantastic. That's really brilliant. And you also are involved with the charity Centrepoint. For anybody that doesn't know what that is, what does Centrepoint do?
So Centrepoint is the UK's largest youth homelessness charity. So based in London, but also with big presence in Manchester and Sunderland and various other cities. And it's really about giving a home and a job to young people who, for a variety of different reasons, have found themselves homeless, either sleeping on the streets or sofa surfing, sleeping on buses, all these kind of different things. And it's a problem that is sadly getting a lot worse at the current time. So there's a huge need for the work that Centrepoint does. And yeah, I've been part of their board for about 9 years, and now just a supporter from the sidelines, really. But I just think it's an amazing charity and something that I've just had a huge privilege to be involved with it at such a high level, really.
Brilliant, brilliant. So productivity, you said, began because you had to do the whole thing all by yourself. You had to teach yourself to be much more productive and much more organized. Where did you start to learn about it? How did you teach yourself?
Well, my thing was just reading every single book and blog that I could come up with. This was probably back in 2007, 2008. So it's kind of the early days of blogs and sort of lots of stuff on the internet and lots of different books. And there were a few books that really kind of resonated with me. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was a big book for me. David Allen, Getting Things Done, was a big book for me. Some of Seth Godin's work, some of Merlin Mann's work. Lots of people like that. And it really kind of what I started to do really was to take different bits of all these different approaches and just say, what's working for me, what's not, and just use myself as a bit of a laboratory. And in the end, just came up with a framework and a system that seemed to work for me, that seemed to cut away some of the stuff that was a little bit too complicated, I thought, from some of those other books, and just start to create a system that really, really worked for me.
It's interesting, actually, because there's lots of different views about, work-life balance out there. There's people saying that, you shouldn't work weekends. And then there's people like Gary Vee, who has a great following, that's saying you should be up at 5 o'clock in the morning and working 18 hours days and effort. What's your take on work-life balance?
Well, I have a kind of love-hate relationship with Gary Vee. I love his philosophies on many things. I find his view on hustle, as he often terms it, like just deeply disturbing and actually quite dangerous. And he, to be fair to him, in interviews has said things along the lines of, I have the energy to do this. I know that most other people don't, so they shouldn't try. This is just what works for me. But people just take it too literally. So, I don't work weekends. I work a 4-day week. I work Monday to Thursday. I do essentially 37.5 hours of a kind of full week, but basically Monday to Thursday. And that's due to me having childcare and various other things going on as well. But I have a 3-day weekend, and actually my company does too. So Think Productive does a 4-day week. And what people really love about that is that, you have a weekend, which is a couple of days of relaxation, but usually in a 2-day weekend, you've also got work to do. You've got laundry and you've got house admin and remortgage forms to fill in, all these things that we have to do in life admin. So what often happens is with our team, they tend to do that stuff on the Friday and then still have 2 days off. And I think a 3-day weekend feels infinitely bigger and more expansive than a 2-day one. And there's lots of studies that show that actually it's more productive to work 4 days, even, cutting down the hours as well, which we don't do. We basically still work the same hours, but actually cutting down the hours, you can actually get more done in a short amount of time as well. So.
Did you find that hard to implement, though? Because there are always clients who want things on a Friday, and are they happy to wait till the Monday?
Well, yeah, it doesn't affect clients. So we have a system where the 4-day week is basically everybody does 1 Friday in 4, and that's what makes it much more easy and palatable to do 5 days in 4. So there's basically always someone on the phone on a Friday. That was when we implemented it. That was and it kind of came through a discussion between myself and some of the other staff members. And one of the things that I said as the business owner and at the time the leader of the business, I said, there are some lines that we can't cross here. And one of them is it doesn't affect clients. It doesn't affect our frontline service. If people want workshops on a Friday, that still happens. All these kind of things have to be, set as non-negotiables first, and then we see how we can fit that in. And we've managed to make that work really well. And there's some amazing positives to it as well. So I think it really helps to define a culture within Think Productive that's very focused on work-life balance and on kind of emotional intelligence and not avoiding burnout and all those kind of things. And I also think it probably really helps with retention. I think it would be quite difficult to go from having a 3-day weekend back to having a 2. So it really helps us to keep good people and keep good people motivated as well.
I mean, people listening to this podcast won't see this, but we're doing this on a video call, and I can see how young and rested and well you look. So obviously it's working.
Oh, that's nice, because I've just been up really early with my son, who was being a bit of a rotter. So that's good to hear it's not coming through.
Fantastic. So going back to the book, I read your book, How to Be a Productivity Ninja, over 3 years ago now. And I was trying to find my copy because I thought I'm going to ask you some questions from the book. And somebody has pinched it. And in fact, we had a load of copies. We've sent them all out to clients. But what's brilliant about your book, I remember the stuff. I've been using the stuff. I read it a long time ago. I read it over a Christmas holiday, in fact, and because I was trying to get organized, because I wanted to go into January,
Cool.
with new systems. So I actually don't need to go and find the book, because I can tell you what worked for me, and I'd like you to share some of the things. So the first thing I learned, which was a huge shock, I've been trying all my life to manage my time. And that was the wrong thing to be managing. And it was like, when I read that in your book, I thought, oh goodness, can you share what we should be managing rather than our time?
Yeah, so don't manage time, manage attention. Attention is a much more precious resource than time. So in an average day, you'll have two to 3 hours of what I call proactive attention. So the time in your day where you're most switched on, you're most able to do the most difficult work that's on your plate. And really the trick to all this is how you manage that 2 to 3 hours. And the problem for most people is that, when they've done studies of this, a lot more people are morning people than evening people. How do you tend to spend your mornings? Either catching up on email, or in someone else's boring meeting, or doing stuff where your time is not your own to be autonomous, tends to be the way a lot of people's mornings go. So actually, it's quite difficult to defend ruthlessly that 2 to 3 hours, because it tends to be times when everyone else is kind of having demands on your time. But if you do that, then, what I say is what happens in the rest of your day will look after itself. If you're spending the time in those 2 to 3 hours really focused on the most difficult thing you need to work on, the most strategic, the most intellectually challenging thing that you need to do, then actually the rest of your day, the emails will look after themselves, the other meetings will take place, everything else will be fine. It's often the big stuff that can sit on your to-do list and move from one day to the next, to the next, to the next. That's the stuff that really needs the focus. And the reason that stuff moves down the to-do list day to day is because it's difficult, and because you need to really apply the most quality attention you have to be able to get that stuff done.
Yeah, I know. Brilliant. That really changed my way of thinking. Excuse me. The other thing that you talk about is the concept of a second brain. Now, I've got to that age in my life where I forget stuff. In fact, if anybody meets me in a networking event and I go blank and I've known you for years and I look like a rabbit in the headlights, please introduce yourselves, because my brain, it just stops. So could you share with us what a second brain is?
Oh man, that was also me from the age of about 19, I think. I don't know what happened in my brain, but it all went. And I can bump into people in the street and they're like, Graham, we've met before. And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. There's a condition, isn't it, where you don't remember faces? I think I might have it. But anyway, so yeah, second brain so the concept of second brain is basically saying, if you try and manage all of the stuff that you're working on, so all of the different projects and actions and all this kind of stuff, if you try and manage it all in your head, then you're going to get lost very, very quickly. We all know that our short-term memory is not that great. And if you don't believe me, remember the times when you've played that game. I went to the shops and I bought, and someone says a thing and someone says another thing. You can't get past 5 or 6 things in that game. So what that means is we know our short-term memory is not great at trying to retain information. And the best use of our brain really is all the other stuff. So strategic decision-making, intuitive thinking, prioritizing. Our brain's really good at looking at all that complexity and then making really good choices, generally speaking. So managing all of those projects and actions in a second brain frees up your brain for the creativity, the strategy, all the other stuff that it's really good at. And the second brain is something that you learn to trust. So having a really good system of projects and actions, and also having those actions laid out within your second brain based on the level of attention you need. So having the stuff that's, the proactive attention, the hard stuff in one little list, so that when you have that time, that's the only stuff you see. When you're out and about, here's the 5 things I can do when I'm, nearby some shops or whatever, having all your calls in the same place. Once you start to trust that as a system that's going to really work for you, then you don't need to keep any of that stuff in your head, which it just frees you up. It's an incredibly sort of freeing place to be able to just capture a new idea, put it in your second brain, and you don't need to think about it for the rest of the day. And you can really, it gives you focus and energy on the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, that was really powerful too. And the other thing that revolutionized my life was your email Xero policy.
Yeah.
Now, I have to confess, I can't do it every day. I tend to do it once a week. I haven't managed to get it down to every day. And in fact, it's a whole workshop. I think you could talk about it for an entire day. So I'm not going to ask you to tell us how to get our emails down to Xero literally in one answer, but maybe you could give us one tip on how to manage a raging email inbox.
Well, I was just going to say one thing about that is you said you have to confess that you only get it down once a week. I don't know that that's actually a confession. So
Is it not?
if you only need to get it down to zero once a week, because what is zero ultimately? I mean, zero doesn't really matter, right? So a lot of people get this confused with inbox zero, that it's somehow about I've got to get to the end, yes, tick. And of course, there will always be more emails coming through. It's much more about saying, I'm on top of the decisions that I need to make about all these different emails. And I know there's nothing buried on page 4 or page 5 or, further down. So it's much more about just saying, do I have a good handle on this? And if, through the course of a week, that nothing's going to slip between the cracks, then it's actually fine. If you get 6 emails a month, do it monthly, right? Like, it's fine. Unless all of those 6 emails might well be, the sort of $1 million deal kind of emails, and then you're checking it every hour or every minute or whatever. So I think it's, for me, it's again about the relationship we have with information and how we make sense of how that information affects everything else that we're working on. So for me, once you've got a really good sense of that, then, the system allows you to be really in control. So for me, I tend to probably every 2 days, I'll get back to inbox zero, and then it just gives me that really good sense of calm around what I'm doing. I'd say anybody, listening to this with like 5,000 emails or just thinking, well, how on earth do I do that? The biggest shortcut I can give you as just a big tip is to start by, we tend to when we look at the email software, if you open up an email in Microsoft Outlook or Google, and our eyes read left to right, okay? So the first thing you'll see on the left-hand side is usually the big button that says reply. So the email is kind of geared, and our brains are kind of geared that everything needs a response. And if you flip that around completely and say, actually what I'm doing here is there's a whole heap of rubbish and I'm panning for gold within that. And there'll be 3 out of those 100 that really matter. If you flip it around that way, if you've got 5,000 emails, the very first thing you can do is anything older than 3 months, either chuck it in a folder or press delete and just, Control A, select all, get rid of all that stuff. And once you start to think of it in that way, you don't have 5,000 emails and a 5,000 email problem. You have, a 2-month problem or a 1-month problem, or just the stuff that's come in recently kind of problem. So once you start to see it in that way, then you can pan for the gold there with the stuff that probably still does matter and still does have something that needs doing with it.
I like that, looking for the gold. I like that. I've written that down because that will help me again every week when I'm doing that. So you're talking about lots of emails, you're talking about lots of noise. There's so much information, which, as you said, there's so many distractions. Now there's social media, which there never used to be. I think it makes it really hard for you to focus. So is there any advice on focusing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a massive, that's a massive question. I think there's so many different ways of focusing. I think one thing that really matters is we need to think about our thinking. And often it's seen that thinking at work is some kind of luxury that we'll get to in 2 weeks' time. And actually, we're in a stage now where, as knowledge workers, thinking is our work. So the creativity, the strategy, all of that really high value thinking that we do as humans, that's the stuff that really matters, because ultimately a lot of the other stuff can get replaced by machines and robots and everything else. And ultimately the stuff where you really add the value is the stuff where you're being creative, or you're making decisions, you're solving problems, all those kind of things. So giving ourselves the space for thinking is absolutely essential. It should never be seen as a luxury. And what that then means in terms of the practicalities, deep down in the weeds of, I have my phone, it has Facebook on it, it has Twitter on it, and all those kind of things, is you need to really recognize that willpower is completely overrated. If you don't, if you're not thinking about the fact that there's, 1,000 people sat in Silicon Valley whose entire job is to bring you back to your phone as often as possible and to make it as addictive as possible, then you're going to lose. Sorry, right? So I think that the ways around that stuff are, so I use an app called Quality Time at the moment, which basically turns off certain apps on my phone and makes them inaccessible for certain hours of the day. So the time when I have that proactive attention, I cannot access Twitter. I can't get Google Chrome on my phone. I can see WhatsApp if I go into it and want to message somebody else, but I don't see the notifications coming in. I don't have all the beeps and noises and all that kind of stuff. And so it basically screens out a lot of the noise. And once you get into a sort of mode of working, a way of working where you say, all those things are really addictive, I don't trust myself because willpower is overrated, then you can get some strategies in place to kind of deal with that. And you can use this software, you know, you can use this across desktop PCs and everything else. There's an app called Freedom, which does very similar things on a desktop. So it will just cut off the internet at certain times. I've had times, particularly when I'm on a writing deadline, where I'll literally turn the Wi-Fi off at source, at the wall, like have it on a time switch, basically. So like for certain hours of the day, it's just not accessible. So recognizing that we're going to lack focus and we are going to be interrupted, you know, I think you can either take that as something that you can control and take hold of it and deal with it, or you can play the victim and say, oh, you know, I'm in an open plan office and Facebook, and well, you know, you have choices over most of those things. And actually, when I coach people, often the open plan office is a big thing that comes up as, I don't have a choice around that. And I said, well, will anyone mind if you go and sit in a coffee shop around the corner for an hour while you do your thinking and prioritization and all that kind of stuff? You know, can you take your laptop and sit in the little cupboard and do your emails in there? You know, there are ways of doing this where you can make yourself, in the ninja terms, stealth and camouflage, deliberately unavailable, you know, in order to really do that quality thinking and create that space.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic advice, and you're absolutely right. And I was going to ask you about open plan offices, so thank you for that. Mm-hmm. What about virtual teams, though, where because we have virtual teams, so what will happen is somebody will come, have a problem, and they, you know, their priority is obviously to do their work, and they will interrupt me in order, or interrupt another member of the team. So that can be quite difficult then to say, look, do not disturb, don't contact me because I'm in my 2.5 hour zone. I suppose you have to be a little bit flexible, do you then?
Yeah, and I think also that's about give and take, isn't it? So I think what's important here is within the team, bringing those full conversations to the surface. So rather than the conversation just being a micro one about you saying, I'm in my 2.5 hour zone, you know, don't touch me kind of thing, actually having a team conversation about when collectively do we have the best attention, when individually do we have the best attention, how do we deal with that, which communication channels are we using? So for example, within Think Productive, Think Productive does a lot of its work virtually. So we have a bunch of what we call productivity ninjas who are around the country doing the workshops. We have members of our team who used to live in Brighton and then have now moved away to London and Manchester and different places. So we do a lot of our work on Slack. I am not on Slack. You can't get me on Slack. And that's because my main job within Think Productive these days is writing, and Slack is just not conducive to writing. But it doesn't mean you can't get hold of me. So I'm still on WhatsApp, I'm still on the phone, and people still know that if there's something that's really urgent, they can call me or they can email me or whatever. You know, depending on, you know, how quickly they need a response, there are ways to reach me. But that's, you know, that's my decision, but also couched in what do the team need from me. And I think, you know, you can have these conversations. Those conversations are either going to happen when people are stressed because it's like, I'm defending my sanctuary right now, or you can bring them to the table where no one's stressed and have them in a group environment and have it on a kind of macro level rather than micro level. And I just think people are just not having those kind of conversations often enough, particularly when tech changes and culture changes. And I think, you know, when we've been into organizations and done that kind of work with people, you know, you really see the benefits of, I don't need to reply to an email instantly. I can wait an hour to get back to a client. Like these expectations that are unsaid and sort of built on assumptions often end up not being true anyway.
Brilliant. Absolutely. I mean, I've written so many notes during this and I'm going to go back and listen again and write more notes. Absolutely fantastic. So you live in Brighton, you mentioned before. Yeah. You are the productivity ninja. How does the productivity ninja spend his spare time?
Okay. So this weekend I have a little boy who is 4.5. He also has autism. So I spend a lot of my time preparing for things that we're going to do. So this weekend we're actually going to stay at a friend of ours. We're going to go camping in her back garden, basically as rehearsal to go camping at WOMAD Festival, which is in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. And we did WOMAD Festival last year and we did all the preparation again last year, but he just needs that kind of extra bit. So there's a lot of rehearsing and a lot of hanging out with small children and that kind of thing. My other big obsessions are sport. So I'm a big, for my sins, a big Aston Villa fan. It's been pretty miserable over the last few years, but I still have a season ticket there and go up there regularly. And my other big love is baseball. So I go over to if I got spare time where I can get away, I will generally fly to Toronto and then follow the Toronto Blue Jays around. So I'll go to Toronto, and then the team goes off to Kansas, and I'll go to Kansas, and then they go to New York, and I go to New York, and just follow them around for 10 days basically, and then come home. So, and they play basically every day. Baseball is 162 games a year. So in a 10-day trip, I'll generally see like 9 games.
How did you get into baseball? That's an interesting one.
So geeky, eh? I got into it because Think Productive had an office in Calgary in Canada, and my publisher was in Toronto. So I'd often come over to Toronto, stay over there, and then go to Calgary. And in Toronto, I didn't know anyone, so I had really nothing to do. And I just thought, I'll go and watch baseball. It's on, great. And the first couple of times I went, I didn't really love it. I didn't really understand it. I really enjoyed the atmosphere and everything. And then one day I sat next to a guy from KPMG, and he spent the whole night really generously explaining all the rules, all the tactics. It's a huge intellectual game. There's so much going on in terms of the tactics and strategies with baseball, both from a kind of, a really micro level, like this one pitcher and this one hitter, right through to what they're going to do in 5 years' time. And you can kind of track the whole strategy. It's really kind of very engaging. And so he explained all this stuff to me, and I was just like, wow, this is so cool. And I've just been obsessed ever since. So I came back to England, and you can download an app where you can watch all the games live. Some of them are on in the evenings here, which is fine. Some of them are like 1 o'clock in the morning. I try and avoid those ones if I can. But if it's a big game, I'll stay up late.
Brilliant. That sounds fantastic. So finally, you are also a podcast host. You've been doing it a bit longer than me, so thank you very much. Congratulations. Yeah. So tell us a bit about your podcast and why you haven't invited me to be a guest.
Because I can't pin your diary down, Maria. That's the thing. I looked at our Skype message, which said, I'm just adding you on Skype for ready for our interview, and it was February, and we're now recording this in June. So we have very difficult diaries. So I definitely want to get you on the podcast.
That's put me on the spot, hasn't it?
So, and actually part of the reason logistically I don't do that many podcasts is I do them all face to face. They're all about an hour, sometimes even an hour and a half long, and they're very in depth. So it tends to be it's a whole kind of afternoon, a whole kind of travel trip and that kind of thing. But the basic idea is it's called Beyond Busy, and it's really a podcast that explores the intersections and the tensions between the topics of productivity, work-life balance, and then how people define happiness and success, and basically the kind of idea of living a good life and what's important to people. And the reason I wanted to explore that, I think there's a book in there somewhere, and I thought if I started doing a podcast and talking about these topics, it would basically become research for the book. So the idea with the podcast at the beginning was that the podcast would not only have these interviews but also track the progress of me writing the book. The writing of the book's been really slow, so I've ended up actually putting that book on hold and I'm doing a couple of other books at the moment, and I'm going to come back to that book. But it's like a slow cooker, slow cooking a casserole over 4 years or something. But yeah, so the idea is just to explore these tensions, and I think it's really interesting where people really solve productivity and they go, yeah, like I'm being really productive, and what they don't realize, or sometimes do realize, is they're burning out, or their work-life balance has become appalling to make that happen. You talked about Gary Vee before. I mean, I'd imagine he's hugely productive. Like, I don't know how much time he'll see his kids and and how many hours he sleeps and various other things like that. So I think, productivity, work-life balance. And on the other kind of side of it, happiness and success. I think I'm really interested in what motivates people. Is a great work-life balance and good productivity enough? Do people really get their sense of self more from being productive than from, say, their family life, or the other way around? And I just find that human motivation piece just really fascinating. I've interviewed everyone from Olympic gold medalists to CEOs to founders to professional clowns, comedians, all these different people. Probably the only safe conclusion I've drawn from all the hours of interviews I've done is humans are weird. Humans are so weird. And I think, once you recognize that, and once you start to see that actually there's so much complexity, and so many of us are carrying stories from childhood and from things that we were taught at school, and we thought that was the truth, and all these kind of things, I think that really adds to what makes it a kind of fascinating topic. And there is a book in there somewhere, and it's, well, there better be, because I'm on a deadline in 2 years' time for it. I've signed the deal. But at the moment, I'm still kind of exploring the topics and kind of working out where I sit within it as well. It feels like a daunting one because in some ways it's Graham writes a book about the meaning of life, isn't it really? But I think, what's interesting is you can start to also frame that not just on what do I think about it, but also I've got, these hundreds of people that I've interviewed, what do they think about it too?
I think there is a book in there. I think it's a very productive way of using your time on your podcast that you're also going to create a book. And I agree with you.